Welcome everyone to our Navigating Workplace Grievances, a practical guide for employers. It's great to have you here. And I can't start without making reference to the football. So for those of you that watched obviously England versus Argentina last night, don't worry. We are hoping to keep today's discussions a little less tense than some of the moments we saw on the pitch. And that's all I'm going to say. So today's session is designed to be practical, useful, rather than overly focused on legal jargon or technical detail. So we'll be concentrating on building confidence, staying compliant, and helping you reduce the risk in a way that feels manageable and realistic. For those of you that have joined us before, we like to kind of keep it as easy to understand and indeed apply as possible. So by the end of the session, you will hopefully leave with clear, actionable steps that you can start applying straight away. So in terms of us, usually it's Liz and I, but she is otherwise engaged today. So I am leading. I'm Lizzie Walsh. I'm the HR business partner here at Halliday's HR. And I'm joined by my colleague, Chloe Griffiths, who is our HR advisor. So for those of you that don't know, Halliday's HR is a HR training and recruitment consultancy practice based in Stockport. So as always, we are recording today's webinar and we will be sharing this with you after, along with a copy of the slides. You are very welcome to have your camera on if you want, but if you are eating your lunch, it's fine to leave it off. We've turned your microphones off though, but if you do have any questions, please just use the chat function and we'll take a look at those at the end of this session. So our aim over the next 45 minutes then is to make the grievance process feel clearer, more manageable, and most importantly, less daunting. So by the end of the session, hopefully you will have a solid understanding of what is a workplace grievance, informal versus formal concerns, the legal framework and ACAS guidance, the grievance process and the whole step-by-step approach, conducting fair investigations, common employer mistakes, and early resolution strategies. So, as I've said, we'll keep everything practical and relatable. And if you do have any questions, pop them in the chat. We'll have some time at the end. So, why does getting it right even matter when it comes to handling grievances? Well, grievance handling matters for a lot of reasons, and it's much more about simply following a process. Handled well, grievances help protect employee well-being, they improve workplace culture, and show that concerns are taken seriously. But they also demonstrate fairness and consistency, which is incredibly important for trust within a team. But from a company perspective, good grievance handling can reduce the risk of tribunals and legal disputes. It supports retention and productivity, and it can even help identify wider issues within the business before they grow into bigger problems. And one thing that is important to remember is that employees will often judge an employer less on the original issue itself and more on how their concern was handled. So even when the initial problem is relatively minor, poor handling can damage the relationship and escalate those matters quite significantly. So in practice, mishandled grievances often appear in cases, and we see it kind of if it involves constructive dismissal or discrimination, whistleblowing, and even unfair dismissal claims. But there is also that wider impact to consider. You've got that reputational damage, word of mouth, there's, social media and whatnot. It's massive these days. It can really be quite damaging to a business. You've got the loss of morale with your workforce, but also the amount of management time and energy that can be consumed dealing with escalated disputes. So what is a grievance then? So ACAS define it as a concern, problem, or complaint raised by an employee about their work, working conditions, or relationships at work. And to be honest, when it comes to a grievance, everybody obviously will be concerned about different things. They will take, they'll have a problem with different things. And it's almost a case of just because it's a problem to them and not another employee doesn't mean it kind of, reduces the seriousness of how they perceive matters to be. But some of the common examples are bullying or harassment, discrimination, pay disputes, workload concerns, so if some people feel that workload hasn't been allocated fairly, or somebody is really struggling in terms of like too much workload or even too little. We've seen it happen. Management behaviour and that whole perception of how somebody feels that they're being treated. It could be in relation to their working hours or, holiday issues. If you've had to decline a holiday, people can take up a grievance as a result of that. And then there can be conflict between colleagues. So, and that's a very short list in all fairness. Like I say, it can be anything and everything, unfortunately. But not every complaint begins with somebody submitting a formal grievance email or a letter, if people even still do send letters these days. But in reality, concerns often start much earlier and much more informally. And managers can sometimes miss those early warning signs because grievances, they can sometimes come across just as verbal comments, frustration, emotional reactions, that kind of indirect concerns that are raised in conversation, in passing, rather than actually in writing. So that's why it's really important to recognise that the grievance process shouldn't only begin when somebody writes formal grievance at the top of their letter or in the subject line of an email. Unfortunately, by that stage, the issue has probably already escalated. But spotting the concerns early and responding appropriately can make a huge difference in resolving issues before relationships break down or matters do become more formal. So where appropriate, employers should try to encourage that early informal resolution. So in many situations, you can find that having that open, honest conversation, addressing those concerns quickly, can resolve the issues before they do indeed escalate. So, for example, things like, minor communication problems, misunderstandings, or, those day-to-day working tensions can often be dealt with informally and quite effectively. But it's equally important to recognise when a matter is too serious for an informal approach. So things like, if you've got allegations involving discrimination, bullying, harassment, or other serious misconduct, usually they would require a formal process straight away, just to ensure that the issue is properly investigated and handled fairly. So the key, I guess, is knowing when an informal conversation is appropriate and when the seriousness of the allegation means that that formal action is necessary from the outset. But obviously, we would always be able to advise in terms of which approach we would feel would best protect yourselves. So there are a few key legal principles that do underpin grievance handling. So these include the ACAS Code of Practice. So ACAS is the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, which I'm sure you're familiar with. We've then got the Employment Rights Act 1996, the Equality Act 2010, and we've also got the implied duty of trust and confidence that exists between employers and employees. And, what you tend to see a lot of in terms of claims are, employees say that whole trust and confidence, it's broken, it's irreparable. So ideally, that's what you want to be avoiding. But in practice, what this really means is that employers should aim to act reasonably throughout the process. So concerns should be properly investigated, a fair and consistent process should be followed, and employees should have the opportunity to be accompanied at formal meetings if they wish. And it's also important that employees are given the right of appeal to decisions, as that forms part of a fair grievance process. So before outlining the actual formal process, I think it is important to understand what we refer to as hidden grievances. So at times, an employee can actually raise concerns that amount to a grievance without explicitly stating that they are doing so. So, for example, an email that appears to be, just kind of that general dissatisfaction, or, may well perceived as a little bit of having a bit of a rant, having another moan. It could actually, in fact, constitute an informal grievance. Similarly, an employee that resigns, it may be that they set out their concerns within the resignation letter that may well give rise to perhaps a little bit of an underlying issue, or perhaps the reason for their departure. As I've mentioned, concerns can be raised verbally, so this could be when you're holding your one-to-one meetings, it could be in your team meetings, it could just be a comment made in passing, all of which should be noted and considered appropriately. And then finally, we've got disciplinary hearings. So sometimes what can happen when you are in the process of a hearing or even at the investigation stage, is that something could be mentioned that we would perhaps consider mitigating circumstances. And it may well be relevant that, under kind of those circumstances, that we have to pause the investigation or the disciplinary proceedings in order to address what's been raised as a grievance. That's not to say you can't then pick back up the disciplinary process. It's just that we just have to pause those proceedings whilst we look at the grievance. But where any such concerns are raised, it's just important to clarify with the employee whether they wish to raise a grievance or whether they're kind of seeking, whether they want to make it formal or whether actually they're seeking an informal resolution. And I guess there's that element of care needs to be taken not to encourage or pressure an employee to submit a formal grievance, but all concerns need to be acknowledged and addressed appropriately. So I guess it's about, you've mentioned in your one-to-one about, such and such, is everything okay? Just kind of asking those probing questions just to kind of get to the bottom of actually, is this something that you can just resolve because it was a miscommunication or it was a misunderstanding, or actually, is there something underlying that needs to be addressed? Okay, so looking then at a typical formal grievance process, kind of the step-by-step approach. So this is in line with ACAS Code of Practice. So if for whatever reason you don't have a grievance policy, which you should because it is a statutory policy, but if you don't have one and a grievance lands on your desk, then we would always say as a bare minimum, the ACAS Code of Practice is the minimum standard that you need to work through. Obviously, you will, if you've got a handbook with us, if you're a client, you will have a policy. You may well have some clients, some businesses, I've seen it previously, can have a bit more of an enhanced version. So sometimes businesses can have an additional step. So I would just say, just caveat that this process is the bare minimum, but please do just familiarise yourself with, your own policy. But there's no single perfect process that every business must follow, but there just needs to be a process that, it's reasonable, it's fair, and most importantly, it's consistently applied. And I think, 4 key principles to remember throughout each stage is about timeliness. You don't want these things to be dragging on for the sake of everybody involved. It's about clear documentation. It's about remaining neutral. Just because somebody's put in a grievance, we all have our opinions, we all have our views on the matter, but it is just about, if you are the one that's investigating, it is about remaining neutral, and having good communication. So in terms of the process then, so look, this is assuming that you've tried to address things informally and it's not worked, or actually it was of a serious nature that, you've gone straight to the formal process. So the employee raises a concern, they've put an email to you. So this is the starting point where that formal issue or complaint is raised. So obviously it should be acknowledged promptly. That really helps to build that trust. It reassures the employee that the matter's being taken seriously. And it's also important to explain the next steps and the expected timelines at this stage. Now, the difference with a grievances, for those of you that have perhaps been involved in disciplinaries, you would do your investigation first and then you would go to a hearing. However, grievance is the other way around. So you would hold a formal hearing with the employee because at this point, this is where you want to be discussing the concerns in detail. So, if you're chairing the hearing, you're sitting down with the employee, you're giving them the opportunity to explain from their perspective what it is that they are aggrieved about, why it is they are aggrieved. Ideally, you want them to be backing things up with evidence. Dates, times, that sort of thing. But it's really important at this stage to understand what resolution they are seeking, because I think, I've seen it. Some people can be quite guilty of throwing a load of things at you as a manager or as a business. You've not done this and da-da-da, but they're not actually saying what they want out of it. So it is key to kind of, before you conclude the hearing, asking how they perceive, and how they want to move forward from this in terms of what that resolution looks like. And then once you've held the hearing, next you do the investigation stage. So you've heard the employee's perspective. So next is looking at other facts and evidence. It may well be that they've presented some documents. It may well be that they've name dropped a few people. So it might be that you need to speak to them as witnesses and get some statements. It might be that you need to, if it's pay related, speak to your payroll provider, or, check through your emails and whatever it takes essentially to carry out that investigation. But during that, it's just about remaining neutral and objective. And then ultimately, once you've reviewed all of the information, that's when a decision is made. So the outcome, it should be fair, reasonable, and consistent with company policy. If you are in the unfortunate situation of, this isn't the first time you've had such a grievance, then also considering what the outcome was last time in terms of, how it is you propose to address this one. And ideally, I think, if you can confirm the outcome in person, especially if you are not agreeing with what they are saying. So if you are not upholding their decision, I think if you can sit down with the person and really explain why it is that, you're not agreeing with them, it can really help to emphasize the decision reached. And then you would follow it up in writing. However, we're all busy. If it isn't reasonably possible, to sit down and to talk it through, it is absolutely fine to simply send the outcome to the individual in writing. They should be given the opportunity to appeal the decision if they believe that the outcome was unfair or if they believe that the process was flawed in some way. And if you do receive an appeal, the person that then chairs that appeal, ideally you want it to be somebody different. So somebody that has not been previously involved, which I appreciate in smaller businesses, you end up running out of people because you've not got enough management layers. We help quite a number of clients out in terms of doing appeals because they've not got the people. But in the eyes of the law, if you like, if as a small business you need to rely on, the same people, then, you wouldn't be penalised essentially for that, because there would be a recognition that actually, it had to be the same person. But overall, a good grievance process, it's less about perfection and more about fairness, consistency, and just maintaining that respectful communication throughout. So we're going to talk through a few of those steps in a bit more detail. So first up is responding to a grievance then. So when that grievance is raised, best practice is to respond promptly, as I mentioned, so that the employee knows that the concern is being taken seriously. Because if anything is unclear, you can really take the time to clarify the issues before moving forward. And it's also important to assess whether there are any immediate risks or urgent concerns that perhaps need attention. And at this stage, this is where you should also be considering whether the issue could be resolved informally or whether actually, no, do you know what, this needs to move into a formal process. If it does proceed formally, obviously you are needing to appoint an appropriate manager or investigator to deal with it. And ideally, you want somebody that is experienced or at least can speak to us, and we can coach them in terms of what it is that they need to do and what it is that they need to say. But there are also a few important considerations to keep in mind. So, for example, thinking about, is there a safeguarding concern or a potential discrimination issue involved? Is there any conflict of interest that could affect that whole fairness and impartiality? And although it's rare in grievance cases, I don't think I'm yet to see it, but potentially you may need to consider where suspension is necessary. But I would certainly advise seeking advice at that point if you are thinking that actually you need to remove the individual. But one really practical tip is to avoid becoming defensive or jumping to conclusions too early. I think when it comes to the whole resolution piece, what we tend to see is, a manager gets a grievance and they instantly start thinking, well, they're going to want more money, they're going to want this, they want this person sacking, and there can be a tendency to jump to those conclusions and make those assumptions, where actually, when you ask the individual, what resolution are you seeking? Sometimes it can just be, I just want an apology. And you're like, oh, okay. So you've kind of got yourself all like built up and the anxiety, because you think that you're going to have to do this big, massive piece of work when actually the individual just wants, an apology or a recognition or whatever. But it's very much just about, listening, gathering the information and approaching the situation objectively. So during a grievance hearing then, the main aim is to give the employee a fair opportunity to explain their concerns and feel that they've genuinely been listened to, okay? So the hearing should create that space for the employee to talk through what's happened in their own words. So asking open questions can really help, really can be quite difficult for an employee to kind of talk through their concerns. So, if you are well versed in asking open questions and kind of encouraging them, that can really help, rather than jumping straight into conclusions or even asking quite closed questions. Sometimes you might need to kind of, if it's quite difficult for the individual, you might need to just give them a little bit of time, pause, try and, if you met with silence, perhaps try and not fill it. Just give the individual a little bit of space and time, to kind of gather their thoughts. But some of the kind of more encouraging questions that you could ask might be, can you help me understand what happened? Or, in terms of the resolution side of things, what outcome are you hoping from this? Sometimes individuals will put the outcome in their actual written grievance, which is really quite helpful. But if they don't, the hearing is absolutely the place to kind of probe a little bit more. But your active listening is really important here, so paying attention, clarifying points where needed, just making sure that all of the information has been discussed. The employee should be allowed to be accompanied during the meeting. So generally we would say that this is a workplace colleague or a trade union representative. However, if they want to bring a partner or a friend, the legal side, the legal answer is no, but it potentially could be classed as, what we would call a reasonable adjustment. It's down to you as a business to decide whether or not you feel it is reasonable to allow that to happen. But just, the main thing we say all the time in HR in the hearing, make sure that you take notes. If you're doing it on Teams, obviously great, because you can transcribe the notes. I've been in meetings, grievance meetings very recently actually, where I've met people in person, but I've actually had a Teams meeting running in the background to transcribe the notes. So yes, I'll still take a few handwritten notes, but you've just got that Teams transcript, or we've got a fancy AI Claude as well. There's a whole host of things out there. But yeah, really important to make sure that you keep clear notes and of the discussion and mainly any key points that were raised. And one practical point before I hand over to Chloe is just to remember, about the tone that you're speaking in. It matters just as much as the process. As I said at the beginning, employees very much remember how they were treated during the meeting more than the actual technical details of the procedure itself. So I know I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but that whole calm, respectful, professional approach can really make a significant difference, even in, what can be a really difficult conversation. So yeah, thank you. Over to Chloe now to talk you through the next steps.
Thanks, Lizzie. So when carrying out the grievance investigation, the aim is to understand the employee's concerns fully and gather enough information to reach a fair and balanced outcome. A good grievance investigation should be prompt, objective, proportionate, confidential, and well documented throughout. In practice, this means gathering relevant evidence linked to the grievance, speaking to any witnesses or individuals involved, reviewing documents and messages or policies where appropriate, and keeping accurate notes of all the conversations and your findings. It's important to look at the situation from all perspectives, not just the manager's and not just the employee's point of view. It's also worth remembering that a grievance investigation doesn't need to be overly formal. I think Lizzie's kind of covered that previously in terms of judging. Is it an informal conversation that's going to resolve this, or do we need to take a more formal approach? But the key is that the investigation is reasonable, thorough enough for the issues that are raised, and carried out fairly. A common mistake in grievance investigations is focusing only on the information that supports an existing management view, rather than genuinely exploring the employee's concerns objectively. Confidentiality is especially important during a grievance investigation. Information should be shared on a need-to-know basis to protect those involved and to help maintain trust within that process. So once the grievance investigation has been completed, the employer then needs to reach and communicate a decision. There are a few possible outcomes, and the grievance may be fully upheld, partially upheld, or unsubstantiated, depending on the evidence and the findings. Whatever the outcome, it's important that the employee clearly understands how the decision was reached, and the outcome letter should therefore explain the findings and the reasons behind the decision, and then any action that would be taken as a result of those findings. It should also confirm the employee's right to appeal and how that process would work. A key point to remember is that employers are not required to agree with the employee's grievance. However, the decision does need to be reasonable, evidence-based, and supported by the information gathered. And it's also important to avoid vague conclusions or overly emotional language within that outcome. The rationale should be clear, balanced, and professional, so that the employee can see that their concerns were properly considered, even if the grievance isn't upheld or fully upheld. So I just want to mention mediation as a possible outcome within a grievance process. In some situations, particularly where the issue is more about a breakdown in a working relationship or in communication, mediation can be really effective. It's a voluntary process, and both parties need to agree to take part. It's also facilitated by a neutral third party, which helps to create a safe space for open communication and a constructive conversation between both parties. The focus of the mediation isn't about deciding who's right and who's wrong, or making formal findings. Instead, it's about helping individuals rebuild communication and finding a way to move forward and work together effectively. It's often most useful where there's ongoing tension or maybe a conflict, but where both sides are willing to engage in trying to resolve things. That said, it's not always appropriate in every case. For example, where there are serious allegations such as discrimination or harassment, those would require a formal investigation, and mediation wouldn't replace that formal process. but where it is suitable, it can be really helpful and a great way of resolving issues and building that working relationship back and moving forward, essentially. So when an employee appeals the grievance outcome, if they do, the appeal should be treated as a genuine opportunity to review the original decision fairly and objectively. Ideally, the appeal would be handled by a different manager or more senior manager if possible. I know Lizzie mentioned that it's not always the case within a small company and you wouldn't be penalised for that, but where appropriate, it's advised to do so. And an important part is, if possible, someone leading that process that hasn't been involved or been a decision maker in any part of that previous process, to maintain that impartiality and build confidence in the appeal process. And the purpose of the appeal is not just to repeat the original meetings, but to review both the process that was followed and the decision that was reached. And this would include considering whether the investigation was reasonable, whether the outcome was supported by the evidence, and whether any new evidence or information has come to light or been put forward since that original decision was made. So appeals are an important safeguard within that grievance process, and they help demonstrate procedural fairness and show employees that concerns are being taken seriously, essentially, at every stage of the process. One common mistake, though, is treating an appeal as simply a rubber stamping exercise. So where the original decision is automatically upheld without proper review and evidence, even if the final outcome remains the same, the appeal still needs to be approached with an open, impartial mindset. Sorry, I'm just going to have a quick sip.
It's a warm day.
It's a warm one. So when looking at the grievance handling, there are a number of common pitfalls that managers should try to avoid. One of the biggest issues is delaying action. So even when a grievance is really complex, long periods of silence or slow responses can quickly damage trust and escalate the tensions. So poor documentation is also another common problem. If conversations, decisions, or actions aren't properly recorded, this can also become harder to demonstrate that the process was fair and that it was reasonable. And a lack of impartiality can also undermine the entire process. Employees need to feel that the concerns are being considered objectively, without bias or without predetermined views. It's also important not to ignore informal concerns. So sometimes issues are raised casually or informally, and they can develop into larger problems if they aren't addressed early. Other risks include treating employees inconsistently, deciding the outcome before the investigation is complete, breaching confidentiality, or failing to follow the company's own grievance policy. And in practice, tribunals often focus less on whether a mistake happened in the workplace and more on how the employer responded once those concerns were raised. So a fair, reasonable, and well-managed process can make a significant difference. And from an employment law perspective, this can be there can be significant risks if a grievance is not handled properly. At a practical level, employees may lose trust in the business, become disengaged, or decide to seek employment elsewhere. Poor grievance handling can have a real impact on morale, retention, and just the general workplace culture. So there's also risks to consider if an employer fails to deal with the grievance fairly or reasonably, and this can damage the relationship of mutual trust and confidence between the employer and the employee. And in some cases, that may allow the employee to resign and bring a constructive dismissal claim. Employers may also face claims linked to the underlying grievance itself, particularly where issues such as discrimination, harassment, bullying, whistleblowing, or victimisation are involved. And a poorly handled process can sometimes worsen that legal position rather than improve it. Another important point is that employment tribunals will often look closely at how the employer responded once the concerns were raised. Even where the original workplace issue may have been manageable, a flawed grievance process, for example, delays, lack of impartiality, as mentioned, poor communication, or failure to investigate properly, these issues can increase legal and reputational risk significantly. There can also be financial consequences, compensation awards, legal costs of going to a tribunal, management time, employee absence, and reputational damage. These can all arise from mishandling a grievance. And ultimately, a fair and reasonable grievance process is not just about legal compliance, it's also about maintaining trust, protecting workplace relationships, and demonstrating that concerns are taken seriously. So to wrap up, there's some really practical strategies that can make a big difference in reducing the need for formal grievance processes in the first place. A lot of this comes down to encouraging open communication across your teams, so issues are raised early rather than later, they don't build up. It also relies heavily on equipping managers with the confidence and skills to handle these difficult conversations effectively, which again is something we can support with. Regular check-ins can help as well because they create a safe space for smaller concerns to be picked up and addressed before escalating. And in some situations, using mediation can be really useful in resolving informal issues, especially where it's a relationship breakdown and there's a willingness to move forward. It's also important to address behaviours early, rather than allowing patterns to develop over time, and to actively foster an environment of psychological safety where employees feel able to speak up without fear. And a key message to take away is that the prevention is always significantly easier than the formal resolution. In reality, many grievances don't arise from malicious intent, but from misunderstandings and poor communication that have escalated. And finally, a useful phrase to keep in mind is a grievance procedure should be your primary culture strategy. So if you're relying on it too heavily, it can usually indicate that issues are being dealt with too late rather than early. And to finish, I just want to briefly explain how we can support clients and when it comes to grievance situations and wider employee relations issues. So we can step in at any stage to support the process depending on what your needs are and the size of your business, those kind of things. It might include providing advice and guidance when a grievance is first raised, or carrying out an independent investigation, or supporting managers in preparing for and conducting those grievance hearings. In some cases, it can also be that we would chair an investigation hearing, and alongside that, we also provide support in making sure outcomes are fair, well reasoned and clearly communicated, including assisting with the documentation and appeal processes where that's required as well. Beyond individual cases, a big part of what we do is preventative. Our line manager training delivers we deliver this either in person or online, and goes into much more detail on handling grievances, but also covers other key areas such as having the difficult conversations, managing conflict, and supportive, effective resolution before issues escalate. And additionally, we're trained mediators and can facilitate workplace mediation. So ultimately, the aim is not to deal, excuse me, with grievances. The aim is not just to deal with the grievances when they arise, but to help build managers' confidence and the capability so that the issues are handled earlier, more consistently, and ultimately with less risk of escalation. So here are our contact details, and I'll just have a look if we have any questions in the chat. I don't think we do.
Anybody have any questions? Pop them in the chat if you want. We'll just give it a little 10 seconds. Obviously, if you have got a case that you want to talk about, then you can contact us and we'll be happy to help.
No, I don't think we're getting any at the moment. So thanks for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of the day, and we will send out a copy of the slides and the recording to you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. Take care.